Welcome back to our study in the book of Genesis, and we're looking at Genesis chapter 30 with Laban's New Deal. The overview: Jacob's wages. Jacob wanted Laban to release him, but Laban wanted Jacob to stay. Jacob agreed to continue serving Laban. In return, his wages would be all speckled and spotted sheep, all the brown lambs, and all the spotted and speckled goats. The events in the next few studies of Scripture seem to depict two con men, each trying to outcon the other. In the grace and providence of God, it will be Jacob who comes out the winner, but for reasons completely different from those that he expected. Many of us, like Jacob, have a tendency to give God the credit for prospering our sinful efforts to get ahead. It was in spite of Jacob's conniving that he left Laban as a wealthy man. It was neither his spirituality nor his shrewdness which got him ahead in life. 30 verse 25 says, "Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children from whom I have served you, and let me depart, for you yourself know my service which I have rendered to you.' But Laban said to him, 'If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed me on your account. Name me your wages, and I will give it.' But he said to him, 'You yourself know how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude. The Lord has blessed you whenever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?' So he said, 'What shall I give you?' And Jacob said, 'Well, you shall not give me anything. If you'll do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you come concerning my wages. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen.' And Laban said, 'Good, let it be according to your word.' So he removed on that day the striped and spotted male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep, and gave them unto the care of his sons. And he put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. The 14 years of service for Leah and Rachel were fulfilled shortly after the birth of Joseph. Just as Jacob reminded Laban that it was time to take his wife, so he must seek his release so that he might return to his homeland and family. Several factors would have contributed to Jacob's desire to leave. First, his feelings toward Laban might not have been positive at this point. He had been deceived, and his return had already been delayed 7 years longer than he had expected. There certainly would have been a desire to return to his family. Well, we do not know if Rebekah was still alive. At least Isaac was. Finally, God had revealed to him that one day would someday return to the promised land where he would be blessed. Having fulfilled his obligation to Laban, Jacob was technically free to go. But Laban was reluctant to see this happen. Laban had come to realize that his prosperity was the result of Jacob's presence. If Jacob were to stay, Laban reasoned, it would be on the basis of the profit motive. All of Jacob's labor over these 14 years had been in lieu of a dowry. He had nothing to show for his labor except for his wives and family. It was now time to renegotiate Jacob's contract, and Laban asked him to name his terms. Jacob was in no hurry to do this. He first strengthened his position by underscoring in Laban's mind the value he would be to him, just as had been evident in the past. Jacob now had a family to provide for. Thus his wages must be adequate to meet their needs. Jacob must think of the future. Laban's offer, he suggested, will have to be a good one. Now that Laban is prepared to accept a hard bargain, Jacob names his terms. Frankly, Laban must have breathed a sigh of relief, for the request was one that was easy to accept. Normally, goats in that land were black or dark brown, seldom white or spotted with white. On the other hand, sheep were nearly always white, infrequently black or spotted. Jacob offered to continue working as a tender of the flocks if he were to receive the rarer of the offspring. Jacob would examine the flocks that day, removing all the animals which would be later marked so as to be his property. These animals would be taken 3 days' distance and kept by Laban's sons. Only his newborn spotted or striped would become Jacob's property. At some time later, the herd would be examined and the spotted or striped animals would go to Jacob, while the rest would be Laban's. It was too good to be true, Laban must have thought. How could he possibly lose? However, it was an open-ended agreement which encouraged Jacob to attempt to manipulate the outcome. It also left God free to overrule the normal course of nature in order to bless Jacob. The agreement was solidified, and the flocks were divided, with Jacob tending the unspotted, unspeckled, unstriped animals of Laban. Jacob and Laban must have both departed while chuckling to themselves. Each thought the agreement was one that they could manipulate to their own advantage at the expense of the other. Rather than conscientiously tending the flocks of Laban while looking to God for the increase, Jacob decided that this was something he himself could handle best by resorting to his schemes and devices. Jacob employed 3 techniques which appeared to result in great success. It says, then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and palm trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the gutters, even in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face towards the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban, and he put his own herds apart and didn't put them with Laban's flock. Moreover, it came about whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, that Jacob would place the rods in the sight of the flock in the gutters so they might mate by the rods. When the flock was feeble, he didn't put them in, so the feebler were Laban's and stronger Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. The first method Jacob used was peeling poles, which were supposed to have some kind of prenatal influence on the flocks. Jacob supposed that if the flocks had a visual impression of stripes while they were mating and conceiving, the offspring would assume this same form. So all about the trenches which served as watering troughs, Jacob placed these peeled poles, and every appearance would incline him to believe that his scheme was actually working, for the resulting offspring were striped, speckled, or spotted. The second phase of Jacob's plan was to predispose. The outcome was to segregate the flocks. The striped, speckled, and spotted offspring which belonged to Jacob were put off by themselves. The rest of the flock was faced towards these animals which are either striped or all black. While the peeled poles were artificial, the striped animals were the real McCoy. Surely by seeing these animals, the rest of the flock would get the idea. The third phase was a stroke of genius. It was a kind of selective breeding. We are told that the lambing took place twice during the year, once in the autumn and once in the spring. These born in the autumn were thought to be hardier, since they were most to endure their harsh winter. Jacob placed his peeled poles only in front of the hardier animals and not before the weaker. In Jacob's mind, the result was the strong animals went to him, while the weaker ones went to Laban. From everything that has been said, we would naturally conclude that the great prosperity of Jacob was due to his shrewd techniques for manipulating the outcome of the mating of the flocks. So it would seem, and so it seemed to Jacob. There's only one problem: it didn't work, because it couldn't work. From a physical point of view, all of Jacob's schemes were of no avail because they operated on one assumption. That assumption was scientifically erroneous. Each of the three techniques Jacob employed was predicated on the belief that visual impressions at the time of conception affected the outcome at birth. In the first and third techniques, it was the pale poles which were thought to produce striped offspring. No one believes that this is true today. No farmer uses this technique to upgrade his cattle. The second device of Jacob was based on the same premise, but used the blackened stripe of the flock to create the visual impressions. Only later will be told the real reason for Jacob's prosperity. But mark this well. Jacob didn't prosper because he pulled one over on Laban. Jacob's success was not the product of his schemes. So we see Jacob became exceedingly prosperous. Large flocks, male and female and male servants, camels and donkeys. Laban's sons began to complain, and Laban's attitude towards Jacob changed. Just as Jacob's deception of his father had adverse side effects, so Jacob's newly obtained prosperity produced its own problems. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and what belonged to our father he has made all of his wealth. Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly towards him as formerly. So 2 significant changes have occurred since Jacob first arrived at Paddan, and these brought about a family crisis. First, Jacob, who arrived penniless, had now become prosperous, and this at the expense of Laban. Secondly, when Jacob first arrived, there was no mention of Laban having any sons, but now Laban has sons of his own. In addition to these hard facts, we must consider one more factor which we have learned from archaeology. A man who didn't have sons of his own could adopt a near relative who could then become his son. At times, this son would be given a daughter in marriage by his new father. If the father later had sons of his own, the inheritance would have to be divided among these heirs in some fashion. The son who had the rights of the firstborn and therefore headship over the family would in that culture be given the household gods, which would signify his headship. From these facts we can read somewhat between the lines of the story and surmise with some confidence the cause of the change in attitude towards Jacob and his family. Initially, Laban looked on Jacob as his son, as his heir. But when sons of his own came along, this was no longer needed. In fact, Jacob was now a competitor for the family inheritance. When Jacob prospered at Laban's expense, it's easy to understand why Laban's sons looked on him with disfavour, for all their inheritance was fleeing before their very eyes. Thus, the change in attitude on the part of Laban and his sons brought about a change of plans for Jacob. Not only did circumstances seem to dictate this change. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and your family, and I will be with you. The last recorded revelation Jacob had received was 20 years previously, while he was still in the land of promise. Now God revealed to Jacob it was time to return to his homeland. The impression is given that Jacob had received no other revelation during the 20 years. Jacob's actions would seem to confirm his conclusion, for little was said of God and his will until this time. What circumstances suggested Jacob do, God instructed Jacob to do. He was to return to his homeland and to his relatives. Jacob didn't worry about convincing his father-in-law, but he did find it necessary to have the support of his wives. They must now choose between their father and their husband. In order to have a private conversation, Jacob called his wives to him in the field. A dirty deal. Jacob's first line of defense was to the effect that their father had given him a dirty deal. Jacob called Rachel and Leah out to the field when he was watching the flocks so he could talk things over with them. Your father has turned against me and is not treating me like he used to, but the God of my father has been with me. You know how hard I have worked for your father, but he has tricked me, breaking his wage agreement with me time and time again, but God has not allowed him to do to me any harm. For if he said the speckled animals were mine, the whole flock began to produce speckled lambs. And when he changed his mind and said I could have the streaked ones, then all the lambs were born streaked. In this way God has made me wealthy at your father's expense. Things were not as they used to be. For some unknown reason, Laban's attitude had strangely changed towards Jacob. While not favoured by Laban, God has been on Jacob's side. The inference is that this could be seen by Jacob's prosperity. Besides this, God had spoken to Jacob, confirming his blessing and directing him to return to the land of promise. During the mating season, I had a dream, and I saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then, in my dream, the angel of God said to me, "Jacob." And I replied, "Yes, I'm listening." The angel said, "Look, and you will see that only the streaked, speckled, spotted males are mating with the females. I have seen what Laban has done to you. I am the God you in Bethel, the place where you anointed the pillar of stone and made a vow to serve me. Now, leave this country. Return to the land you came from." All that Jacob saw in his dream was a divine direction to return home. The vision of the striped, speckled, and mottled goats seemed to justify all that he had done to manipulate the mating and offspring of the flocks. The same God who gave him the upper hand over Laban had also revealed himself at Bethel and was instructing Jacob to return. At least Jacob was able to convince his wives that it was right to leave Laban. They recognized that no longer were in their father's favour. Laban favoured his sons, considered Jacob and his wives only a liability, a threat. Laban sold his daughters to Jacob and then spent the proceeds on himself. There was no love lost between his woman and their father. They wouldn't find it hard to leave Laban. While what Jacob understood was true in part, he didn't see nearly enough in this vision. God had not commended him for his attempts to manipulate matters against Laban to his own advantage. In fact, the prosperity which he experienced had nothing to do with his fervent efforts. All these polls and peeling and segregation were of no profit whatever. A careful look at the words describing the dream will make this clear. Notice how God drew Jacob's attention to the fact that the males that were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. Earlier it was said that all of Jacob's efforts were based upon a faulty premise. A visual impression during conception would influence the animal born. In the vision which Jacob had from God, there were no peeled poles, no segregated flocks, but only male goats mating that were striped, speckled, and mottled. Now, what lesson was God getting across to Jacob, or at least to us in retrospect? What determined the offspring of the flocks was not the circumstances, the visual impressions at conception, but the characteristic of the males that mated with the female goats. Jacob's attention was drawn to the fact that all the male goats which were mating were striped, speckled, and mottled. To put it another way, only the striped, speckled, and mottled males were mating, none of the rest. Now this we know to be a very significant factor in determining the characteristics of the offspring. Like father, like son, we say. While Jacob operated upon an entirely false premise, God was working on a premise that is scientifically proven. How was it that only the striped, speckled, and mottled males were mating? Simply God organizing it to be so, in order that Laban's wealth would be passed on to Jacob. Think of it all. Think of it. All of Jacob's efforts were of no benefit. All that time peeling poles and separating flocks and striving to outdo Laban was all for nothing. What seemed at the moment to be the work of Jacob's hands and the outcome of his schemes was nothing of the sort. It was the hand of God, in spite of Jacob's scheming, not because of it. It's interesting also that we have described here genetic engineering that we're very familiar with today. Conclusion: the parallels between Jacob's sojourning in Padan Aram and Israel's bondage in Egypt must have been evident to the nation as they first read this account from the pen of Moses. Jacob's sin necessitated this departure, just as Joseph's journey was the result of many sins. Jacob went to Padan Aram a poor man, but he left with a large family and great wealth. Joseph was sent to Egypt a virtual slave, but when the nation emerged at the Exodus, there were many, and they had considerable wealth. Just as Laban was judged of God by his wealth being given to Jacob, so Egypt was judged by the wealth that was taken out of Exodus. While these similarities are rather striking, there remains yet one further parallel, which would be very instructive to the nation of Israel. Jacob's wealth did not come through his scheming, but in spite of it. Jacob was not blessed of God because of his godliness, but due to God's grace. So also the Israelites were to understand that their blessings were a gift from God, apart from the sin-stained works of their own hands. Here in the Old Testament we see the grace of God demonstrated clearly. Someone once said, ethics is the difference between morality and legality. Ethics is the difference between what I ought to do and what the law demands I must do. And this is a description of an explanation of ethics. Jacob totally lacked any ethical system at this point in his life. For Jacob, legality was equated with morality. That is, anything which was not contrary to the law was no problem for his conscience. The purchase of the birthright from Esau was meticulously legal, but technically unethical. The deception of Isaac in order to obtain the blessing was technically legal. In fact, it even brought about what God had promised would happen, but in a way that was displeasing to God. Jacob's proposal to work 7 years for Rachel, the younger daughter, was legal, but was not really acceptable to Laban. Finally, Jacob's contract with Laban and his manipulation of the flocks in order to prosper at Laban's expense was hardly ethical, but technically, strictly, it was legal. So much so, in fact, that he could later challenge Laban to accuse him of any infractions of their agreement. It was Jacob's lack of any ethical framework to guide and govern his conduct which resulted in a very painful parting when it came time to leave Padan and return to the land of promise. The consequences of questionable ethics are clearly seen in this final encounter between Jacob and his uncle Laban. We shall find that things have changed little from that life and times of Jacob, for ethics are few and far between in our day as well. We shall consider the basis for ethical conduct and the consequences of their absence as we study the events in the life of Jacob as he makes his exodus from Padan. Jacob flees Laban. Jacob takes his whole family and departs. Laban was away when they left. When Laban returned, he went out in pursuit of Jacob. Then Jacob arose and put his children and his wives upon camels, and he drove them away all his livestock, and all his property which he had gathered. His acquired livestock which he had gathered in Padan, to go to the land of Canaan to the father Isaac. When Laban had gone to shear his flock, then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob deceived Laban the Syrian by not telling him he was fleeing. So he fled with all he had, and he arose and crossed the Euphrates River and set his face towards the hill country of Gilead. Circumstances strongly suggested that it was time for Jacob to return to the land of promise, and by divine revelation God commanded Jacob to do just that. Also, having received the assurance that his wives were in support of his move, Jacob hastily packed up all the goods and left for home. It doesn't appear to be accidental that he departed at a time when Laban was busy occupied in shearing his flock. Leaving without any warning, Jacob reasoned was the best way to depart without any resistance from Laban, who might have refused to release Jacob's wives or his flocks. What Jacob didn't know was that Rachel had stolen Laban's idols just before they departed. Many speculations are made concerning Rachel's motives, but the reason best supported by the text and by archaeology is that Rachel stole the household gods in order to establish a future claim on Laban's family inheritance. The household idols or gods were a token of rightful claim to the possessions of the headship of the family. Rachel must have felt justified in stealing his gods and expecting to share in the family inheritance. After all, this is what she and Leah had just affirmed to Jacob. Do we still have a portion of our inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you. In Rachel's mind, getting Laban's wealth was God's will. If that was so with the matter of the flocks which Jacob had been tending, why should it not also be true of the estate at Laban's death? It seems Rachel felt entirely justified in stealing the family gods for this reason. It's interesting, however, that she didn't tell Jacob of her theft. Two wrongs are thus committed in the departure of Jacob and his family from Paddan. First, Jacob is left without telling Laban about it, and at a time when it would have been inconvenient for him to prevent it. Second, Rachel has stolen Laban's family gods, which are the token of the right to claim a portion of Laban's inheritance and the headship of the family. Jacob was doing the will of God and returning to the land of promise, but he was not doing so in God's way. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, then he took his kinsman with him, pursued him in a distance of 7 days' journey. He overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream of the night and said to him, "Be careful that you do not speak to Jacob either good or bad." If you were Laban, would you have come to the same conclusion? His gods were gone, and so would Jacob, hastily and secretly. Laban caught up with Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen camped in the hill country of Gilead. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done by deceiving me and carrying away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and deceive me and didn't tell me, so that I might have sent you away with joy and with songs, with timbrel and with lyre, and did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters?" Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, "Be careful not to speak either good or bad to Jacob." Now you have indeed gone away because you long greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? While Laban attempts to throw a smoke screen by playing the part of the offended father and grandfather, his real interest was in regaining possession of his gods. Catching up with Jacob was no easy matter. He gained 3 days lead time. By the time Laban had rushed home, discovered the loss of his gods, and gathered the relatives, who we would gather were armed for battle, a 4th day must have been lost. After 7 days, Laban caught up with Jacob, but his intentions were certainly altered by the divine warning contained in the dream he had had the night before. The two men met face to face. The message Laban received was a simple one: "Be careful that you do not speak to Jacob either good or bad." From a similar expression in 24:50, we must understand God to be warning Laban not to attempt to change Jacob's course of action, let alone to bring harm to him in any way. When Laban confronted Jacob the following day, God's warning didn't prevent him from rebuking him for his hasty departure, which deprived him of any kind of farewell. It's not the departure that Laban protested, but Jacob's desire to return home was understandable. What troubled Laban was the way in which Jacob left. Jacob had stolen away, literally stolen the heart of Laban, while at the same time Rachel had stolen his gods. Laban worked very hard at playing the part of the offended father and grandfather, whose deep affection for his daughters and grandchildren caused him much agony when he found he had secretly left without any goodbyes. Most of his protest is voiced in this note, but there seems to be a considerable lack of sincerity here. Rachel and Leah had indicated he showed little concern for them any longer. The real bone of contention was the stolen gods. Why did you steal my gods? This was the bottom line. This was the reason for the hot pursuit, accompanied by other relatives who were probably prepared to fight. This explains why God warned Laban not to do anything harmful to Jacob. If Jacob got away with his gods, he could someday return and make a claim to his estate. This could not be tolerated. Jacob's response was not made from a position of strength. His words at first are rather weak defense of his stealthy escape, while his remaining words are in response to the matter of the stolen gods, of which he had no personal knowledge. Jacob answered and said to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I said, lest you would take your daughters from me by force. The one with whom you find your God shall not live in the presence of your kings, and point out what is yours among my belongings. Take it for yourself." For Jacob didn't know that Rachel had stolen them. Jacob's conduct was a result of fear, just as the deception of his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham had been. Jacob didn't have sufficient faith that God would deliver him from the hand of his own father-in-law. In his fear, he had to question the truthfulness of the words which God had spoken to him at Bethel. "Behold, I am with you. I will keep you. Wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Jacob had not yet come to the place where he could trust God to accomplish his word without some backup system, which included Jacob's manipulation or deception. Having gotten the upper hand over Laban in the last 6 years, Jacob was not certain that Laban would let him go without a fight. Perhaps he would not let his daughters go either. This was not a discussion that Jacob was eager to prolong, for he had very little reasoning that could justify his recent actions. Feeling certain he was innocent of the charge of stealing Laban's gods, Jacob turns the conversation to this issue. Laban was urged to make a diligent search of Jacob's goods to try and find his gods. Whoever was caught with him, they would die. Jacob obviously had no idea that his favourite, his beloved Rachel, she was the culprit. That Laban was most interested in his gods, not in goodbyes, is seen by his subsequent actions. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maids, but he didn't find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods out and put them in the camel's saddle, and she was sitting on them. Laban felt through all the tent but didn't find them. She said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of woman is upon me." So he searched but did not find the household gods. Obviously Laban didn't suspect Rachel either. He first searched Jacob's tent. Who would be more likely to have stolen his gods than Jacob? Was he not the one who had come to Padan because of his desire to inherit the headship of Isaac's family and have the rights of the firstborn? The theft of the family gods would give Jacob preeminence over Laban's household, just as his deception had gained it over Isaac's household. Having searched carefully in Jacob's tent, Laban went on to Leah's tent, then to the two maids. Only last did he come to the tent of Rachel. She was the least suspect of all, and yet she was the guilty party. She successfully concealed the theft by clever distraction. She sat on the very saddle which hid the gods of Laban. When he searched every other part of the tent, she explained she must remain seated because of a monthly infirmity common to women. Laban didn't want to wish to press the matter any further, and so Rachel's theft was not discovered. We don't know when or if Rachel told Jacob of her theft, but we can well imagine what his response must have been. Had Rachel's team been discovered, very different sequence of events would have followed. As it was, Jacob's sheepishness over his secret escape was overshadowed by his righteous indignation. Jacob revelled in his innocence. In addition to the assurance he gained from Laban's report that God had spoken to him in the night, preventing him to harm Jacob. In the light of these events, Jacob now seemed to have the upper hand. He held the winning cards. He planned to use them to greatest advantage. The years of friction between these two men now bowled over, and Jacob scalded Laban with holy anger. And Jacob became very angry and contended with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, "What is my transgression? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Though you have felt through all my goods, what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes, your female goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn of beasts I didn't bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. You required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was by day, the heat consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, and so he read judgment last night." Jacob recognized Laban's hurt feelings as a mere facade. The real reason for his hot pursuit was the thought of being wronged by Jacob. Laban had concluded that Jacob had finally stepped over the line. Up to this point, he had always managed to stay one step within the law. With the disappearance of the family gods from his household, Laban thought Jacob had finally gone one step too far in his greed. But now, Laban was caught empty-handed. His charges could not be justified. Not only was there no evidence found in his search, but Laban had been consistently wrong in many other areas. These Jacob was eager to elaborate upon. Never had Laban's herd suffered from Jacob's neglect, nor had he even eaten at Laban's expense. The animals that were lost to natural causes, Jacob replaced, even though he was not responsible. Laban had insisted upon this, and Jacob did so without protest, until now. Jacob worked hard, suffered the hardship of a shepherd's life, and all of this while Laban continued to change his wages repeatedly. Having gotten his years for frustration off his chest, Jacob used his trump card, triumphantly capping off his defense by asserting God was on his side. Had God not been looking out for him, Laban might have got away with his double dealing. All this prosperity Jacob maintained was God's blessing on his life. God had seen his affliction, it was true. But Jacob went too far when he added, "and the toil of my hands." Nowhere had God ever intended to Jacob that his blessing was in any way related to Jacob's works. In fact, God revealed to Jacob that just the opposite was the case. The warning which God had issued to Laban on the previous night was proof to Jacob that God was on his side. God had rendered judgment. God and Jacob maintained that he had been proved innocent. Laban asks Jacob to enter into an agreement of peace. They placed rocks in a pile and ate together. Jacob named the place Gilead, heap of testimony. Laban bid his daughters farewell and left. We come away from Jacob's defense with the uneasy feeling that he has grossly overstated his case. God did see all that Laban had done to Jacob. Jacob's prosperity was from God's hand, but it had little or nothing to do with Jacob's piety or productive genius. God had been blessing him on the basis of grace, but Jacob had used God's intervention as a basis for his self-defense. Jacob maintained that he had prevailed and that God had been intervened because he was spiritual, while Laban was carnal. We find ourselves unconvinced by Jacob's best efforts. Laban doesn't appear to be overly impressed either. While Laban was not being able to prove Jacob's dishonesty, he's still convinced of it. Thus, he initiates the covenant that is made. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what I can do this day to these my daughters, or to their children, but what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to their children whom they have borne? So now come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, and Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. So they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Now Laban called it Jegar-sahadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me this day. Therefore it was named Galeed and Mizpah, for he said, may the Lord watch between you and me when we are absent one from another. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass by this heap to you for harm, and you will not pass by this heap and this pillar to me for harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain. They called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain. Early in the morning, Laban arose. He kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned to his place. All that Jacob took with him was really Laban's, he insisted. It was his wives, his children, his herds. What could he do to resist if he could not retrieve his household gods? The least Laban could do is to make a covenant between him and Jacob, which would guarantee will never make use of these gods to further encroach upon Laban's possessions in the future. Notice that the treaty is initiated by Laban, and that its terms are spelt out by him. Since Laban has not succeeded in holding Jacob in check, Laban now calls upon Jacob's God to do so. A stone was set up as a pillar, and a pile of stones erected as a monument. A covenant meal was shared by Jacob and Laban and the other relatives. Laban managed to get Jacob to swear before his God to several particular things. First, Jacob promised never to mistreat Laban's daughters and never to take any other wives in addition to them. Second, each covenanted that they would not pass that point to harm the other. Having agreed to these matters, Laban said at last farewell to his daughters and the children. Blessing them, he returned to his home. The long and often stormy relationship between Laban and Jacob had finally come to an end. Jacob seems to have come away from his encounter with Laban as the unchallenged winner. But did he really? While Jacob may have convinced himself and his wives of his innocence, he has not convinced us, nor has he changed the mind of Laban. Laban was still certain that Jacob was a crook, but being warned by God, he could do little to stop him. The treaty which he initiated was his only hope, and that treaty was no tribute to Jacob's character. I stop and think about it for a moment. Laban had lived in close association with Jacob for 20 years, and he was convinced of his lack of integrity. He believed that Jacob stole his gods. He believed that Jacob had underhandedly got possession of his flocks. He felt compelled to get Jacob to swear a holy oath that he wouldn't mistreat his wives or someday return to Laban with hostile intent. Does this sound like a man who was convinced that Jacob was a godly man? Just as the covenants between Abimelech and Abraham and later Abimelech and Isaac were evidence of the carnal state of these patriarchs, so this treaty with Laban reveals the character flaws of Jacob. He was a man who couldn't be trusted. He would at least keep the letter of the law, and thus Laban spelled out assurances which he felt were needed. What a poor testimony to the character of Jacob. Yet, Jacob seems to be convinced of his own integrity. He is certain that God is on his side because of his uprightness. How could Jacob be so mistaken? Perhaps the answer is found in the fact that Jacob is really a legalist. Jacob prided himself in being the man who kept the letter of the law. Never, to his knowledge at least, had he ever broken his word. He had made a deal with Laban and always lived up to it. Oh, he had peeled those poles all right, but that was not a breach of their agreement. Jacob equated morality with legality. Whatever was within the law was morally right so far as he was concerned. Thus, he could stand before Laban with justified righteous indignation and demand evidence of his wrongdoing on his part to be put forth. He could claim with great assurance that God was on his side. How could this not be true when Jacob had always lived within the law? Here is the heart of the error of legalism. Legalism equates morality with legality. It believes that righteousness and the keeping of the law are one and the same thing. A man may have no system of ethics whatsoever, but so long as he doesn't break the law, he feels morally pure. He feels confident of the approval and blessing of God. With his mentality, Jacob was hardly different from the Jews of Jesus' day. They felt that being a descendant of Abraham assured them of God's favour. They were confident that a meticulous keeping of the law made them acceptable to God. This puts the Sermon on the Mount in an entirely different light. Jesus spoke these words to Jews who were legalists. They felt that a mere living within the law was sufficient to merit them a righteousness acceptable to God. And Jesus went on to show them that a much greater righteousness was necessary. A genuine faith was more than just a matter of form. Those who were genuinely members of the kingdom were those whose hearts were pure before God. Thus, Jesus dealt more with motives than with methods. He dealt more with function than mere forms. Jacob may have felt himself righteous, but Laban was totally unconvinced. He resorted to legalism, that is, legal covenant, because that was all he could trust Jacob to do, keep a few rules. Many Christians today are no different than Jacob. We, too, are often legalists. We think we are pious and holy because we don't smoke or drink or swear or beat our wives. But ask those who have to work with us, or those who have to employ us, and they will do just as Laban did. They will want to get it all down in writing. You see, even with all our pious talk, the world knows better, for they have to live with us too. While we may keep a certain lists of do's and don'ts, we may undermine and manipulate. We may deceive and destroy. We may seek our success at the expense of others. True righteousness involves much more than keeping a few rules to the letter. It's a matter of the heart also. If you got anything out of this chapters, then please feel free to come back and join us again. Every blessing.